First, and the most important part of this, and I'll say this again at the end, and I might even say it somewhere in the middle, these are my opinions, my opinion zone. They are not the official stance of anybody except for me. And I can't guarantee that these opinions of mine won't change between now and the next time somebody watches this. So, if you're in the Navy, you've seen headlines like this. This one's from, I don't know, about 10 years ago, but even just last week, there was another story about SEAL Team Triad being removed from command. And you occasionally get to see these when they make the news networks, or make it onto Fox News, or to CNN. And along the way, you hit the high water mark from the collisions of 2017, in which the Navy actually proffered charges of negligent homicide against the two commanding officers in those incidents. And what we tend to wonder at the point in time is, what were they thinking? How did this get where we are? The Navy has twice looked at this issue, and in 2004, the Navy Inspector General did an investigation, looked at 5 years worth of data, and kind of figured out that they really didn't know why. And then 4 years later, did a 10-year look, and again said, we really can't find anything that links these removals together. But they did come out and say that we're seeing about 1% of commanding officers being removed, and that's okay. That's not unusual. It's historically acceptable. So I thought, if we've got about 280 ships at the time, what were things like when we were going up to 600 ships? Or at the end of World War II with 6,000? What does 1% look like then? So to do that, you can take that 1%, take a rough fleet size, and just even then you go, well, wait a minute, we probably should have heard about commanding officers being removed from command in the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. Navy was much bigger then. So is that 1% number a legitimate, a valid statement? Before we go any further, I want to talk about some of the technical terms I used in this. Focused on a phrase called a crime of command, which I borrowed from Yale law professor named Gene Fidel. And he wrote on this almost 20 years ago now. These are commands that are crimes unique to being in command. That the only way that you can really be found at fault is if you're in command. If you're in command of a ship and there's a collision, you can be found at fault because you're in command. Of the other 300 people on board, most of them will never face any issues or problems because of that collision. So collision is a crime of command. Collision being when two moving vessels strike each other, which is in contrast to an allision. And I was very happy I could not find any pictures of Navy ships involved in this, though apparently there was a former Navy ship that was just recently allied with the destroyer escort Slater. An allision is when a moving vessel strikes a non-moving object, in this case a bridge. It can happen to other ships. If it happens to the ground, there we go. If a ship runs into the ground, that is a grounding, also a crime of command. The commanding officer can be nowhere near this and still bears responsibility for what's happened. And the last one, which is even in today's era of metal ships, fire or explosion at sea, which is probably worse than any of the others. That's a fire on board USS Enterprise. We had a run of fires in the late 60s, early 70s, and we'll talk about those briefly. A crime of command is not what this Navy Times headline had, which is being a bully, drunk, or a playboy, or any of these other things that anybody out there can be. Just because you're a drunk doesn't mean it's a crime of command. If you are in command and you're a drunk, that's a problem, but it's not a crime of command. It's not unique to being in command. But there's a link between those two issues, and I'll cover that as we get farther along. So, take the 1%, take the crimes of command, and I started looking back 75 years, and I ended up cataloging 1,500 incidents over the course of those 75 years. And when you put that 1%, rough 1% curve in there again, you see there have been a lot of incidents, But in not every case was the commanding officer removed from command. And in some cases, you had fewer incidents per capita per ship in that time frame. So that wasn't giving me enough of an answer about what was going on, because I also knew that some of these commanding officers, not only were they not removed from command, they went on and promoted and went on to higher rank. So if we saw this kind of thing in the 2000s, and just to give you an idea from the 2000s, we're talking this era here for incidents. So you should have seen something like that over in that time frame. Anybody remember seeing this headline from 1959? How about this one from 1986? No, because even though we had a lot of really bad years, these things weren't happening. So we take the incidents, take the numbers. I fight with the clicker. Okay. These are the documented removals that I could find. Recent ones are pretty easy. Post-internet age, fairly easy. But you can track back, and going back in 1945, there were officers removed from command. It has happened historically, but it has not happened in the same way that it has in the last 25, 30 years. So I'm getting closer to trying to figuring out what's going on. I just know there's a difference at this point. So that's the curve of the fleet size. So I mentioned that sometimes commanding officers were still promoted after an incident. So looking at those numbers, some commanding officers were removed, some stayed in. But did the incident impact their careers anyway? And how often was that an issue? So in some cases, commanding officers were removed, not promoted, in which case that incident impacted their career. In other cases, they were not removed and not promoted, so that incident impacted their career. They got to go on with the tour. In the modern parlance, they had a change of command with the band, but did not promote afterwards. A lot of these were 06s in command who didn't become flag officers. So it may or may not have been related to the incident. It may have been just the tyranny of numbers at that point. Some of these officers were 03s and 04s. But there were also officers who were removed from command and promoted, or not removed from command and promoted, in which case they clearly recovered from whatever the incident was. And in today's Navy, the chances of being promoted after being removed from command are minuscule. It was not the case once upon a time. How much not the case? That new line there are the individuals who recovered, who had an incident and were either removed or not removed, but went on to promote. So you can see a change. Oh, that was not a good idea. Okay, blank screen. So there's not a laser pointer for any of you guys doing a briefing here later on. Most of this, I believe, is data and available data. But as you come in, you see a trend of officers that were allowed to recover from incidents. And that trend goes down and continues going down at the same time that the trend of officers being removed from command goes up. So I took this and broke it down into 3 categories based upon the differentiation I was seeing, trying to figure out if there's something going on. The 2 decades right after World War II, coming into the beginning of the major operations in Vietnam, Vietnam into the Reagan buildup, and then my career path, the Reagan buildup and into 2015. And I picked 2015 as an ending point because you have to end someplace. I picked 45 because the Navy in 1941 was not the Navy of 1939, was not the Navy of 1945. But the Navy of 1946 and today's Navy, they're pretty similar. The rules are largely the same. The operations, believe it or not, are largely the same. The complaints from junior officers are almost all the same. So there's a lot of connection there that held together. And if you look at, the graph was one thing, but if you look at just the numbers, so incidents between 45 and 65, about half of those commanding officers recovered and promoted at least once, if not multiple times. just under half between 66 and 85. And then look at the change coming into 1986. In those 3 decades, you're looking at 100 officers per decade being removed, only 65 recovered. That is a huge change. So I get these changes, I'm like, okay, that's great, numbers. They tell me something's going on, but what really was there? So I took those decades, broke them into case studies based solely on available official Navy record, where I could find the boards or courts of inquiry or the investigations into each of these cases. And then I read some more, and I read some more, and I broke things down. This is a quick run through of what the results were. And they told me a lot. I was able to pull a lot more out of here than I expected to. The first thing I found out was the conventional wisdom of why commanding officers are removed from command. It's wrong. The biggest reasons that we are given normally is that alcohol's involved. Well, yeah, it is, but only in the last 5, maybe 10 years. We're told that it's about sex. Well, that's involved too, generally only in the last 20 years since combat exclusion lifted, but it existed before then. And then relationships between junior and seniors, which is separate and distinct from, and I hope I don't have to go into a discussion in here about what the difference is between fraternization and sexual misconduct. The two are not necessarily synonymous. But all of these are about personal misconduct. The conventional wisdom is that it's personal misconduct that has people removed from command. But I also found that the biggest reasons had to do with a death, major press coverage, and significant damage. Either damage involved in bending metal or to the prestige of the Navy. The answers that you would see normally for why these people were removed was a loss of confidence in the ability to command, and a line about the absolute accountability of command, which are great lines. The loss of confidence exists for a reason. It's in law, it's in regulation, and it has a lot to do with the administrative process by which we go through. Absolute accountability, that's more problematic. What did I find? What were my beliefs as to why things are like this? The first and biggest is that we have fewer senior officers at sea. There was a time when the 3-star fleet commander of the fleet lived aboard his flagship here in the Narragansett Bay and would take the launch in to go to the reading room over at the Athenaeum. Now we have fleets that have no ships. I don't know the last time a flag officer who wasn't in command of a battle group spent the night at sea. That's not the way things used to be. There's an anecdote of Arleigh Burke as Chief of Naval Operations riding a destroyer. And this is a post-World War II, not an Arleigh Burke destroyer, not a Spruance-class destroyer, probably a 5,000-ton ship. Chief of Naval Operations embarks with his staff, which was probably 3 people at that point in time, rides the ship from Norfolk down to Key West. I can't find any indication of a modern CNO spending the night on board a ship, much less a week or 2 in transit. We have moved to less formal fact-finding bodies. In the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s, courts of inquiry and boards of inquiry were the means by which these investigations were conducted. Today, it is a 1-person-led investigation, maybe 2, with the support of a half dozen people, and it's very much based on law, not based upon finding out the truth. There's an anecdote from the Samuel B. Roberts mining, in which the commanding officer says that he believes that from the time that the investigator walked on board, the goal was not to find out what the truth was, but to find out who to blame. And that was in '89. We have a tendency not to correct ourselves as things go along. We now treat personal and operational removals from command as the exact same thing. So the process that Jay Wiley, a surface warfare officer who pled guilty at his court-martial to raping 2 of his subordinates, and the process that Bryce Benson and Alfredo Sanchez went through were the same. And that's because we're doing a rules-focused approach. It's not necessarily about what's right or wrong, but what the rules call for. And that is why Bryce Benson is headed to a board of inquiry in preparation for his possible medical retirement and/or regular retirement. So how did we get from this broad rules of the 40s If you ever get a chance to go find the rules and regulations that govern the Navy in 1939 and 1940 and compare them to naval regulations writ large today, it's unbelievable how well we were able to operate a Navy of thousands of ships with a couple dozen pages of paper. We had courts martial, varied punishments. The punishments fit the crime. And now today we have very specific rules, very fixed, very unchanging. And almost everything is dealt with administratively and not via a judicial process. So how do we get there? It's one thing to say these are the differences, but why does it matter? Because those are two important pieces to this conversation. The first one I found is that we have lost the distinction between the words accountable, responsible, and culpable. When you hear the word accountable, or I want to hold someone accountable, most likely what you're interpreting is, we're going to punish that person. And that's not what the word accountable means. Accountable is about being held to account. Account being to tell your story. So if you want to hold someone accountable, you go, hey Mike, why were you late today? It's not, Mike, you were late, I'm going to dock you 10 points on the next exam. Fortunately for Mike, he has no exams in my class, so he's good. When we talk about accountability actions now, as we announce punishments, that's not what the word is intended for. If you're going to punish someone, just say you're punishing them. Don't say you're holding them accountable. And don't say that you're holding them accountable if you're not interested in hearing their story. I'm going to skip to culpable and come back to responsible. Culpable is about blame. If you are culpable for something, then you deserve blame for something. It also means that you had a responsibility. Because if a meteorite comes through the window here, none of us are really culpable for what happens afterwards. Now, if half a dozen people run that way and leave this group over here underneath the rubble and nobody comes in to help, they are then responsible for their actions because they had the opportunity, the power, and the capacity to do something. And this is where responsible comes in. Responsible means that you have an authority and a power to either act or to react. Responsibility is the only one of these three words that has both a forward-looking and a backward-looking term to it. Accountability doesn't look forward, it looks back. Culpability doesn't look forward, it looks back. Responsibility looks both forward and back. But if we mix these words up, it makes it really difficult to understand what we're talking about. There's some other things I found that we can't tell the difference between anymore. Mistake and sin are both seen the same, and guilt and shame are both seen the same. A mistake is an inadvertent act. You don't do it intentionally. And for everything I can see, if you talk about the two 2017 collisions, because those are the most recent that people think about, no one intentionally turned those ships in front of another. It's a mistake. But it's treated as if it was a sin. It's treated as if those individuals knew that they were going to do those things. And I'm not saying that bad things didn't happen. I'm just saying the way you characterize them, no one intentionally woke up. You know, nobody woke up to take the watch and say, I'm going to have a collision today on my watch. That's my goal today. But that ties into guilt and shame. Guilt is when you feel bad about the behavior, but shame is when you feel bad about yourself. So it's okay to say, I can't believe I ran the ship aground. I ran the ship aground. You're thinking about that action. It's not okay to believe that I ran the ship aground. This is about me. And when we characterize things that way, if we say that was completely preventable, the commanding officer should have, we have moved away from assigning guilt and we have instead moved to shaming. And that then ties into a whole other host of mental health issues and suicide issues. And I'm not sure how we're going to dig ourselves out of that one, because we've gotten very accustomed to pointing to an individual and saying, you did this because you're a bad person. Not in those words, not that clearly, but that's the impact of what we're saying. So again, so what? Well, to quote my favorite philosopher from Game of Thrones, you guys can read that. Our leaders today, the system has worked out for them. The system worked out for me. But that doesn't mean it's the right system. That doesn't mean it's the right way to do things. Any profession should be reevaluating its own actions and where it is. And that's one of the things I'm asking us to do, is rethink where we are and why we're there. Why? Here's the parable of the frogs in the boiling pot. As the culture around you changes, as that water increases in temperature, you don't notice it. And after a while, you have to go back and get somebody from the outside to come take a look, which we kind of sort of did 2 years ago. So these are the 4 big reasons that I talked about before. There's one more that if you'd asked me when I first started this, and I thought it was going to be Tailhook or Iowa or the late 60s with the Arnheider affair and the hollow force of the 70s, never did I expect that Hyman G. Rickover would turn out to be a major part of this conversation, a major part of this cultural change. In hindsight, it seems pretty obvious that a guy that was a flag officer for 30 years, from the mid-50s to the mid-80s, who interviewed every senior naval officer for the course of those 3 decades, who interviewed the most recently departed Chief of Naval Operations, how I didn't think that this guy was going to have an impact on the Navy's culture, I'm not sure. I was wrong. But it really only came true and home to me when I found this. I'd seen this quote a number of times, and you guys can read it as it goes through. It talks about responsibility and how Rickover saw responsibility. It's often quoted. I found it in one place, and it was in testimony to the Department of Energy. It's in the congressional record. But in the way it's quoted, this is the way Admiral Oliver in 2014 talked about it in Against the Tide. What's different? Already here, it's a change. And it's quoting someone, but changing the way that he talked about it and the way he thought about it. And this isn't a new concern. It's something that we've kind of forgotten. Ralph Chatham is a lieutenant with a PhD in nuclear physics, headed to his first nuclear power tour as a department head after having finished up a tour in the diesel boats in '78, publishes in Proceedings an attack against Admiral Rickover. That's a gutsy move. Ralph died some years back. I don't remember how far he went in the Navy. But I've heard this line, these lines like this, quoted back to me recently about today's officer corps. That if you don't make a mistake, you'll get ahead. And the way not to make a mistake is only do what you're told. And that worries me. So, talking about professional ethics, this is a precursor for my LPA students that are here. Samuel Huntington is the guy that kind of put forward the idea of professional ethic, talked about a profession having expertise, responsibility, and corporateness. Huntington was kind of a dark guy, focused on the Hobbesian view of the military, in which a military soldier's life was brutal, short, and... Sorry?
Solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short.
Yes, all things we aspire to. And that's focused how we look at ethics. This is Admiral Carter, 3 times back president of the War College, who wrote, "When it comes to ethics, at best, we employ a checklist of what not to do, and at worst, ethical development is a chore." Links very closely into what Lieutenant Chatham wrote in 1978. So, along that time frame, at Admiral Rickover, and I'm not here to praise or bury him. Admiral Rickover was a human being like all the rest of us and had some great challenges in his life that he dealt with and overcame, but he was just a guy. He's also a guy who happened to be a flag officer for 30 years. And that's going to impact everything around him. And it's really hard to argue with his legacy of success. No nuclear accidents. There's no Chernobyl case study in the US, and a lot of that is because of Hyman Rickover. He also helped influence the entire Navy's approach to engineering. But that came at a cost. And by 1989, you start to see some of that cost, the Iowa explosion. And you come into Tailhook. And then you start what the Navy Times covers. So where do we go? Well, the first thing is we have to stop talking about ethics as whether it's a, how did my former boss explain this? Let's see. Ethics is really easy. You just figure out what the right thing to do is and you do it. And that is completely not understanding what ethics is. Ethics is trying to sort out the least of two bad things. It's a dilemma. If it wasn't a dilemma, it would be easy. But you have to know how to differentiate. And that means sometimes you have to make a mistake and recover from it because good judgment comes from bad decisions. We also need to do a little bit more of Rickover. Rickover was fixated on proper language in the right places at the right time. Do I have any nukes in here? Nuke trained officers? Just one? Wow. Education and training. Imagine, for those of you that don't know, nuclear power has a tremendous training pipeline of a year and a half on the front end, and then repeated training throughout. Imagine if we spent that kind of time training naval officers in how to lead, in the psychology of the human mind, instead of just nuclear particles and nuclear physics. We have to recognize that the authority and responsibility given to an E3 is not the same as that is given to an O3 or an O10. The rules maybe should be a little different for an O6 in command than they are for the E6 in charge of the work center. And that's not easy, because we want to be as egalitarian as possible. How can you not have the same rules for everyone? Well, because things are different in different places. We have to get to the point where we can actually go through and understand what the differences are between rules and following the rules. And the example I use is segregation, 1950s, with the soldiers that were enforcing the governor's orders. Were they following the law? Yes. Were they doing the right thing? That's where you go right back to that ethical dilemma. It's a choice of two bads. Which is the least bad, and how do you reconcile that? And I'm not giving an answer. Everybody has to figure that out themselves. But if you try and make it a rules-based checklist, there is no alternative except for being binary. And I mentioned Admiral Burke earlier. I love this quote, and I used this quote for years, and it wasn't until I was deep into the dissertation that I really understood what he was talking about. If commanders focus on their subordinates, if they bend rules for their subordinates, if they break rules for their subordinates, that is wholly different from if they break rules for themselves. And that's a challenge to figure out, because if your sea daddy sets you up with a tour, is that the right thing? Is that the wrong thing? But if all you do is follow the rules over and over and over again and never have a critical thought about what those rules mean and why they are that way, then the rules stay the way they are and nothing changes, and it just gets more and more controlled. And then it makes it more and more difficult to actually think and utilize professional judgment. Rules aren't a guarantee. If we're supposed to have some kind of expertise in leadership, we need to be able to develop that expertise. And just following the rules won't get us there. We have to move towards principles of conduct, things that are, this is the generally right thing to do, not do A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3. And they have to be tied to responsibility and seniority. I should not, as an 06 here teaching at the War College, be under the exact same rule set as an 06 who's in command of a ship. That's not fair to the 06 in command of the ship. And it also somewhat de-incentivizes people in shore duty going to sea, because the rule systems are the same. It's pretty easy not to deal with rules that don't affect me here ashore. But if there's many of them out there at sea, why leave? And again, we haven't always been this way. Hugh Hartshorne and Mark May, and this is something about how people are. They did a study of children back when you could still do this. And they gave them gifts on a playground, and they watched to see what happened. And they found out, basically, we all lie. People lie. So what does that mean? If you have a culture that says, we will not lie, cheat, or tolerate those who do, Then you need to go read Lenny Wong's Lying to Ourselves monograph from a couple years ago. How about the pre-9/11 Army and how they were doing exactly that? Or take a look at any one of the other millions of reports that are submitted every day in our military that aren't quite honest, because if they were, your boss would get angry at you, yell at you, so I'll accept a little bit of risk here. So, okay, people lie. Well, how do we get past that? Dan Ariely, in his book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, talks about some of the ways to do that. Some of them are pretty simple. You do things like recite the Sailor's Creed at quarters. Believe it or not, we're old enough to be kind of cynical and jaded about those things. Sailors aren't, and they see that as a reminder, as a touchstone about doing the right thing. You talk about some of the great heroes of our past as reminders and touchstones about doing the right thing. And even Hyman Rickover, for everything we hear about him and his crazy short-legged stools or the model that got thrown around or salting your food, and if you don't know those stories, they're all about the interviews when he would interview midshipmen and ensigns to become part of the power program. Herbert Case commanded the very first ship that Rickover was assigned to in the Navy. And all the biographies mention that this commanding officer, the ship ran aground, and the commanding officer was held accountable, and it taught Rickover a really important lesson in accountability early on in his career. What they leave out is Kay stayed in command, promoted, and went to command again. The inference is that it's like what we expect, and he got fired and cashiered out of the Navy. Well, that wasn't the lesson, but that's what we're led to believe. And I know it's not the lesson because this guy, Ernest Barrett, had command, pre-commissioning command of a nuclear-powered submarine. On its trials, surfaces and runs into a tanker. Not a good day. He's removed from command. A year later, he's back in the pipeline for 06 command. And he collides with a merchant ship that time, not a tanker. But even Rickover, who most people would say had no ability and capacity to forgive, saw that sometimes you had to give people a second chance. And I'm kind of hoping that anybody who watches this video that may be offended by what I said remembers it's my opinions, and I'm perfectly happy to get a second chance to do things right next time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. I'll take the bottom one here, this command investigation, compare it with the court-martial on top. So William P. Lawrence, helicopter lands on a guided missile destroyer. The helicopter's chocked and chained. Guided missile destroyer is at red deck. For the surface warfare officers out there, that means that the destroyer is free to maneuver. Destroyer maneuvers. Waves pick up, seas pick up, waves impact the helicopter. Indian 614, break the chock and chains. Helicopter rolls over, the air crewman gets out, both pilots drowned in the wreckage, which is recovered a year or two later in the Red Sea. Command investigation is done by 2 officers from the Helo Squadron, and the helicopter was not embarked on board that destroyer. It did come over from the carrier. The investigation takes about 5 months to work its way through the chain of command. The helicopter squadron commanding officer says, okay, yeah, I'm good with that. Destroyer squadron CO says, yeah, I'm good with that. Air wing commander, okay, good, investigation's good. Strike group commander, okay, investigation's good. From there, it diverges and it goes over to Naval Forces, or Naval Air Forces Pacific and Naval Surface Forces Pacific. Naval Surface Forces says, okay, yeah, I'm good. We know there's some issues with destroyers and the way that water impacts and interacts with the hull there. Gets Naval Air Forces, and Naval Air Forces says, no, wait a minute. Commanding officer is ultimately accountable for everything that happens on board their ship. And then investigation runs that direction. There's no recourse for the officer involved. The officer involved had to change command, was selected for captain, was selected for major command, and then that hit the press with the investigation and the findings of the investigation, which were really the changed opinions of the senior officers who'd only read the investigation and changed the opinions of the folks who actually conducted it, which is different from Oh, I'm sorry. And that officer was working at the Naval Academy running the small boats there. Is she still there? I think so?
I took 2 months ago.
Okay. We'll be there until she retires as an 05 at 28 years. And by all accounts, was a diligent, good, hardworking commanding officer who did, and even as you read the investigation, is said to have done nothing wrong by the senior endorser on the investigation. Contrast that with Elliot Laughlin and Queenfish, who in the closing days of World War II sank what he believed to be a destroyer because he fired his torpedoes in the fog. He never visually identified the target, and it turned out instead to be an aid ship loaded with people and goods on its way to, I think they were headed back to Taiwan. Turns out that he had missed not one, not three, but two. When you say not three, because the third message talking about this ship he got, but it didn't make sense because he hadn't seen the first two. He was court-martialed. He was pulled out of command, taken ashore, court-martialed. I can't remember if it was either King or Nimitz that said, "You will court-martial this guy." He's court-martialed within a month, given a non-punitive letter, I think it was, maybe even a punitive letter. And it's 2,000 people died when that, and they were non-combatants, every one of them. Big red cross on the side of the ship. But since he didn't visually ID it, so you've got a war crime, you've got fire. I mean, think about all the things that just right there. The story goes that Nimitz was so upset with the findings of the court-martial that he issued punitive letters to every member of the court-martial board. I couldn't find anything that said it really happened. It makes for a great story, though. That lieutenant commander goes on to be a commander and a captain and actually a 2-star, because we didn't have 1-stars at the time. Retires as a flag officer out of the Naval Academy. And was largely excused when the discussions came up at his flag officer promotion board. It's like, well, he killed a lot of Japs, didn't he? It's a very different way of looking at things. If I had to choose between the two, I don't know, I'd probably go with the person that was driving the ship within operational parameters, following the guidelines that were laid out there, as opposed to the guy who fired on a ship because he didn't pay attention to the message traffic. And when given an opportunity, would say repeatedly, "It's my fault, it's my fault." Well, I had to give the communications officer the worst fit rep he's ever had in his life, because it was really his fault for not bringing the message, but it was my fault. Sorry, Navy football played into that whole conversation too, so I've got an issue with Elliot Laughlin. And that runs pretty comparable. But the biggest difference there is that court-martial, Laughlin was defended by a lawyer. He had the ability to call in a defense. It was a group of 3 senior officers to him, who I think were hand-selected by Nimitz, but still weighed both sides of the equation and decided about what was going on there. And when that court-martial was done, its results were final. Meanwhile, Jana Vavasour had 2 officers who looked at every bit of information, made a recommendation that was accepted until it wasn't, and then changed, and had no recourse and no legal representation, and has gone a different path now because of the administrative approach. Does that illustrate the difference? If I could get to a keyboard, I'd put up the disclaimer again real quick.
Right.
Okay. First, I have not seen either of the 2 investigations. So all I have is conversations with one of the COs involved, one of the XOs involved, the defense attorney for one of them, and what's been in the press. And one of the biggest differentiations is when you get to this, there was a command investigation. So all we got was the command investigation, but we got a narrative that came out from that investigation because it was a dual-purpose investigation, which is allowed for under Admiralty law, but then is exempt from Freedom of Information Act disclosures because it is a attorney-client work product. So any collision between a Navy ship and a non-Navy ship has been investigated that way for at least the last decade. If you're interested in that kind of detail to it, John Cordell wrote some good pieces on the Naval Institute blog. He was the investigating officer for USS Porter. A lot of the things that happened in Porter were very similar to what happened on board Fitzgerald. but the Porter investigation, because it was dual use investigation, was not released, and every FOIA I've submitted and every FOIA anybody else has submitted has been rejected underneath the attorney-client work product privilege. So that's part one. We only have the public statements from the Navy. And the Navy's got a narrative, because the Navy is the prosecutor in this case, and that's just the way things are. So we have only the defense side as a counter. But in every single guilty finding, guilty verdict that we have, it was a plea deal. So Alfredo Sanchez had a plea deal to be able to retire, and he still had to go through a board of inquiry, which came back as no basis for separation, but he'd already agreed to retire as part of the plea deal. So I'm thinking about at first glance, you could say it looks the same, but it's, I think, more of a legal gimmick's the word that comes to mind, and that's not where I'm going at. Each of these court-martials up here were preceded by a board of inquiry, so there was an open investigation in which both sides were able to see what was there. That's not the way things are today. So we don't get to find out what Bryce Benson's side of the story was until after he's issued a secretarial letter of censure, which also has no recourse. So he has that letter and carries that letter with him from here on out. Had there been a board of inquiry instead of a single officer dual purpose investigation ahead of time, everybody involved would have had a chance to have openly made their case as to what was going on, which isn't going to taint a jury pool any more so than what we saw and how things turned out from the summer of 17 until the spring of 19. Possible, but I also know that around here, where we had a CNO that sent a message out saying, we have to stop treating our sailors as if the draft is still on. So the culture was very slow to change. Do I think that women coming in the force had an impact? Yes. Do I think the all-volunteer force had an impact? Yes. Do I think technology had an impact? Yes. But I think the biggest impact above all of those is that at about the same time, right in here, our very last Chief of Naval Operations who served in World War II came in. So every person after that had not had any direct combat experience. I think that was a bigger indicator. I think combat, you saw it with, I think General Dempsey talked about with the Army, that we have to get away from forgiving a lot of things that we were forgiving, and we need to go back to focusing on character again. And there was a larger conversation that he was having, but we have a tendency to let some things either slide or forgive them, take your pick, when combat's been involved, and that's what our history is. Running a ship, there are submarine skippers that ran their subs aground not once but twice and stayed in command. It's different, and the rule sets change. But I do think that combat for leaders made a big difference in what they were willing to accept and change. And then it also depends. I mean, in that same time frame, there's a great story of, what was the submarine? Finback, coming out of Fort Lauderdale, where the commanding officer and his crew had met a go-go dancer, and they got along famously. And he was asked, "Hey, sir, do you mind if she dances on the way out?" He said, "Sure." It was 1974, 75. You know, we're still 15 years away from Tailhook and getting rid of the lunchtime dancers in the clubs, so he didn't think anything of it. It made the press. He got pulled back off of patrol, removed from command. That removal was overturned along the way, but he was done. And the guy I think the guy he relieved ended up becoming a Chief of Naval Operations. So same guy, different time. There's no telling how things change. You get in the press, and it can be a go-go dancer, it can be a margarita machine. The press is going to make everything different. One of the reasons I did ships is because they're easy to track down. You're right, ship has a collision, it's documented, usually makes the press. It's very rare for it not to make the press. There's a really, really good book that talks about some of the differences. It's Gear Up, Mishaps Down by Robert Dunn. Are you familiar with it? It's a really good read. And this is SWO saying aviation book good. It talks about the difference in culture, how the safety culture came around. But there are aviation commanding officers who have been relieved for a string of maintenance issues. And not that far back. There are some that have been relieved because they covered up maintenance issues or altered the facts as an investigation went up. It's one thing to change opinions, it's something else to change the facts. And yeah, don't do that. The biggest place aviators tend to get in trouble command-wise and personal behavior-wise is either on board a ship or with call signs. And that hasn't fully gone away yet. And I don't know where the modern maintenance funding, I just heard a story on a podcast, Navy 2 podcast, talking about an HSC squadron, and there was a maintenance incident, and the investigation came through and found that the maintainers were making shortcuts because of operational reasons. That's not the kind of thing you saw in aviation squadrons before, at least not that I knew of. Something we've been doing on ships since Noah, if not before. So I don't know. I don't think that's a good answer for what you're looking at. But the big thing is, if you're going into aviation command, pick a standard and maintain it. And if the standard is above the basic rules, good. And if you can't fly the aircraft because it's not safe or you don't have the time to do the maintenance, you got to speak up. And the 06s have got to have your back, and the flag officers have got to listen to the people that are on the front lines. So first off, if you do a board of inquiry, that solves everything. Because right now what we have is if you have I'm going to pick on my students back there because they're the names that I know that are not, they're accustomed to me. If Travis goes out and gets drunk and does something stupid, and Mike is driving the ship, stone cold sober, great command climate, and has a collision, the investigative processes are identical. And I don't think they should be. The operational process should follow what the Judge Advocate General Manual calls for, which would either be a board of inquiry or court of inquiry, depending on whether it's internal to the Navy only or includes external parts of the Navy. Getting drunk and being stupid, individual officer investigation, no problem at all. Because far more likely that Travis is going to lawyer up, as he should, where Mike is going to be, hey, this is operational. I can trust the Navy to do this the right way. And he really should lawyer up as well, because we're in a legal process now, regardless of how you look at it. Case in point, Bryce Benson was asleep in his rack. His standing orders have been violated. And he is responsible for, and quite often held culpable for, that collision, even though he was asleep and had nothing directly to do with it. That's the difference. When it comes to what Jay Wiley did, he was completely and solely responsible for what happened. I put it, the DUIs. The real challenge for me sometimes was when a commanding officer was creating a toxic command climate. And I don't put that, I kind of ended up not putting that into the operational realm. That is the kind of thing where the immediate superior in command should get word of it, should step in, should advise, should counsel, and can correct. For me, honestly, if we treated them each individually and differently, because they are, we'd probably be far better off. If we try and have one process that covers all of them, we're going to get it wrong. I have not seen the investigation. It should be far enough along where I will FOIA it. I'm sure that some of the folks from Navy Times will FOIA it. I'm extremely curious to see what's in there. Shortly after he was removed or resigned, depending on which set of emails you follow, I was speaking at the Naval IG Training Symposium, and the folks I talked to there said, no, he had to go. Like, okay, that doesn't comport with my recollections of Admiral Jeff Harley and the way he conducted himself, but I don't have all the answers to it. But for me, there's a clear line. AP story comes out on a Friday. He's gone on Monday. The investigation had long been known to be in process, years. So what was the change? What was the difference? The press story. But that's my opinion from the outside. First, quick anecdote. I've got a former colleague. I used to teach in JMO. His colleague's father was in World War II, had command of a patrol boat, I believe it was, and got removed from command. And the line that this colleague used was, And that was in a time when they couldn't let anything go to waste. So kind of where you sit, where you stand. There were a lot of people in the 40s that looked at it and said, we can't afford to lose anyone. We need everyone for the war effort. And we look back on it and go, you had an extra 0 on what we have, at least, if not 2. I don't know. What worries me sometimes is when I go through and I read things like Admiral O'Coin's piece that he did for the Naval Institute proceedings. It was on the blog, I think it was in the magazine as well, that says that the reason he was removed from command of 7th Fleet is because Admiral Swift told him, if I don't get rid of you, they're going to get rid of me. Those are the kind of things, those are the kind of stories that don't bode well for any of these conversations. But the flip side is, I've seen the guy that relieved me on Whidbey Island had a massive fire, and the investigation recommended his removal, and he remained in command, went on to major command. And the fire was known to be preventable. Don't store linseed oil on board ship. It's something we've known for a long time. Don't store oily rags in an office. It's something we've known for a long time. A lot depends on the climate around. A lot depends on what it was. Shipboard fires are excused much more easily than a collision is. Collisions and groundings are seen to be the kiss of death in the Navy. Nobody recovers from those, except they did. A lot, a whole lot. It didn't mean they weren't punished. It didn't mean they didn't have to do some things to get better. But we didn't take someone who had 20 years of exemplary service up to that point and send them away. Sometimes they went to command ashore. Sometimes they went back to command at sea. We had different options. Other than that, I don't know. There's a whole lot more things that I'm worried about when it comes to the culture around commanding officers and what's been said over the last 2-3 years than the maintenance side of it. But that's part of it. Not that anybody has said it openly, the only real, that quote from Rickover showed up in 3 or 4 investigations starting in the 80s. That was the big, and outside the Navy investigations. It's in the Beirut bombing investigation, because a nuclear-trained submarine officer who's retired did the investigation, built that quote into it. Yeah, could it? Sure. But I think it was James Fallows came here and spoke a number of years back, and he talked about how things in the 50s and 60s, how the military was respected but not revered. And now the military is revered. And that ties into something else I read over the weekend, where the number of times, I think it was senior officers, and this is not a Navy thing, the number of times that senior people in the DC area need to be reminded or told that commutes are not like they were in the 80s, and rentals are not like they are in the 90s in DC. Sometimes the civ-mil divide that gets talked about is more to do with an age and history and recollection divide. Ties back into the LPA class we had last week with the availability heuristic. I don't know. There's a part of me that kind of chuckles because I came into the Navy in the summer of '86, went to the Naval Academy right after Top Gun came out, and I'll retire next June right before Top Gun 2 comes out. So I could say that 30 years right there is all about Maverick and it's all his fault. I don't know. There are lots of ideas and stories given, but unless I can find them in the investigations or people that talk about them and say that's the case. Some of the other things I found, the Navy's a lot safer now than it was. You had, being in the Navy in general for the 18 to 24, the 18 to 30 cohorts, just about the safest place you can be, even combat-wise within the Army. The reason, it's just gotten to be a lot safer. So there's this spike here in the late 60s. I'm going to go back. So 2017, we lost 17 sailors in 2 collisions. 69, there were a dozen major fires, number of major collisions, and I think a couple hundred sailors died. So 2017 statistically is just a blip, but look at how much talk we've had about it. Sometimes because history begins at birth, so if it happened before my birth, it didn't happen. I don't have a lot of big answers. I can just point to some of the trends that have changed, and I can't point to any one thing. That's the insidious nature of the culture change. It just slowly adjusts. 1983, there was a fire on board USS Ranger. Investigation finds that the 2 firemen involved were qualified, were competent, knew what they were supposed to do, and did something wrong. Misaligned fuel pipes, sent fuel over the place, big fire. Investigation works its way up the chain of command and gets to maybe as far as the CNO, and the CNO says, wait a minute, how is it that only these 2 really junior people are being punished for what happened? Where's the supervisory problem? And it got sent, investigation was sent back down. Came back with just about the same findings, which were rejected, and sent back down again. So finally, it's all pulled apart, and turns out that the chief engineer that was there wasn't very good. The plant was old, wasn't being maintained well. The sailors weren't properly trained, well, except for the 2 that went to court-martial and had all the records supporting what they were supposed to do. Chief engineer retired, got a letter. 3, that commanding officer stayed in command but didn't go any further, and he had 2 collisions during his command tour as well. His predecessor had a major scandal with the brig, or maybe it was 2 before that, but they actually censured 3 commanding officers in that process. So yes, people, it's one of those things that bounced back and forth. Except that these 2 guys did something that they knew was wrong, but the supervisors were still punished for something like that. One of the COs in that group actually skated through. He'd already been promoted to flag before the letter came out, so it just kind of got forgotten about. He ends up being the flag officer in charge when Vincennes has its shoot down. He's a flag officer at Tailhook in '91. This guy had a Teflon career. Always at the scene, but never got in trouble for anything. One of the other COs that was involved, I think the one that during the course of the fire, was the guy that helped get Top Gun going. Speaking of Top Gun, but he ended up not moving on any further. Should the investigations find those things? Yes. But sometimes it really is the junior people, the little guys, that did something wrong and they shouldn't have. Is it the commanding officers are not omniscient? They're not omnipotent. They don't control everything that's going on. So pretending that they do is not good for anybody. And it's really not good for those commanding officers. That was a big change in '83. Before that, there's an instance I found of a guy who takes command of a minesweeper in Puerto Rico. Within the first week, the minesweeper explodes and sinks at the pier. 2 weeks later, he's in command of another minesweeper up in Hampton Roads. Investigation rolls its way through, and it's not, the Navy looked at it very differently. It's just different. I'm not sure if that is a satisfactory answer, but there was a change in when things went along. And there are commanding officers today that go around worried that they are one deck seaman, it's a bad decision, away from being taken out. I've seen a lot of head nods out there, and that's not the way it should be. There's a book called, I think it's called Rocks and Shoals, which refers to the old Navy regulations, the pre-World War II regulations. And it talks about the early days of the Navy, the colonial Navy, into the early 1800s. And in that time frame, they found that more often than not, the way that officer misconduct or officer problems were handled was administratively, and to move people out and not do a court-martial. In some cases, it was because the station didn't have enough officers where they could muster enough officers for a court-martial. And others, and the biggest reason, the administrative process the Navy controls, lock, stock, and barrel. The judicial process is not controlled. So it's much more likely that the Navy's not going to get a favorable outcome through a judicial process that it would through an administrative process. And that's why you're seeing, and it's what we do now. We're big enough and been around long enough, we follow the administrative process. So it's been around longer than the internet, I guess is the way to look at it. It's a long-term cultural piece. And we pay a price for it, because there are people that don't necessarily do anything wrong but are accused of it that never get a chance to defend themselves. And then that's why it's pillar to pillory. Drug out, rode out on a rail, and it's done. Sometimes that needs to happen. It shouldn't happen all the time. You know the difference between a cynic and a skeptic, right? So a skeptic is unsure, questions, asks questions a lot. But when given evidence, will go, okay, I accept that. The cynic accepts nothing. It doesn't matter what you hear. So if I came here and told you that a well-meaning Navy establishment said we should do these charges as a signal, and then later on found out they just simply couldn't prove them, so they did the right thing and stepped back from them, there are people in here that'll go, yeah, I don't believe you. If I told you it was, and remember, disclaimer, and I'm giving multiple versions of a possibility here. If I told you, oh, it's my favorite, it's really a conspiracy amongst the 4 stars because they know they can't convict these guys, but they're going to do this story, and then they're going to talk about it a lot so they can get the good press and make it look like they're doing all the right things, but know that in the end, it's never going to go to trial, so it's going to be good for everybody all the way around. Some people are going, I don't believe it. You'd have to ask Admirals Caldwell, Richardson, and their legal staffs as to why they decided to do those charges. Those charges were beyond precedent. I mean, unprecedented has become a really popular word since 2016. And not just in the Navy, but those charges were beyond precedent. And you're right, there were a lot of issues in the Navy's justice system that were shown by that process. I mean, the person that swore the charges out against him was a legalman in D.C. Because that's legit, that's how the admin works. It doesn't have to be somebody who actually was there. Probably should have been somebody who actually had personal knowledge. That's how I thought the justice system worked. But you know, the rules are different sometimes. Maybe they need to get changed and moved back. Because there's the only, based on the way the secretary did it, I don't even think she can go to a Board of Correction of Naval Records for that. The secretary has really, really broad powers when it comes to promotions and retirement rank, which if you've been following the Bus Snodgrass and his book piece, one of the readings about that is that he was threatened with losing his rank in retirement for publishing his book. I mean, unbridled, unlimited power in that respect. So there is no process. If she had not been selected by a board and it was pointed to a fitness report that was later withdrawn, maybe an opportunity. There are a couple commanding officers, or a couple officers out there today whose detachment from command was overturned by the BCNR, the Board of Correction of Naval Records. So depending on the process, this process, no, there's nothing. But I did find a guy who recommended in 1979, and I agree with this idea that if you're going to remove someone from command, that maybe there should be an impartial board that looks at the removal from command. But to get specifically at what happened to Jana Vavasour, we'd have to have a change in law and regulations, or maybe just a change in how the secretary implements those. Admiral Aucoin retired as a 2-star. He had just finished his 7th year, his 2nd job as a 3-star, and the collisions in the last month wiped out 7 previous years of honorable service in that rank. I got a hard time buying that. So, but there's no recourse. He's got no option. That is, the secretary said, therefore it shall be. I'll give you 2 from the 60s. Okay. First, if you're a surface warfare officer in here and you do not have a copy of the Arnheider Affair, go on eBay and find it. It is a fascinating read. And in that case, Marcus Aurelius Arnheider was an interesting guy. And he was removed from command of a destroyer escorter minesweeper off the coast of Vietnam after being in command about 100 days. His defense, because he mounted a vigorous defense that included hearings in Congress, one of the things he said was, you shouldn't have taken me out of command until the investigation was complete. So he was removed before the investigation was complete. The government's approach to it was, well, it's really hard to get sailors to come forward and speak openly if the person they're complaining about is still there. So that was one. The other, about the same time frame. Ship pulls into port in Key West. Ship's in port for 2 days, and the commanding officer gets a letter that, or a radio message, removing him from command, sending him to D.C. Turns out a couple of his sailors had complained to a congressman about the way they were being treated, so the Navy removed him from command. So it has happened. Has it happened recently? I don't know. There isn't a ship out there that 3 or 4 SWOs can't go on board and investigate and find something wrong and find sufficient to remove the commanding officer if you do it right. And that's not the right thing to do. The analogy I've used quite often is commanding officers sit down to play a game of cards. They're dealt some cards, but at no point in time do they know what the game is. So they're sitting there with 3 cards thinking they're playing blackjack, but the Navy's really playing 7-card hold'em or something like that. You don't know. They're being asked to do more with less, and a 3-decade cycle of that. We've known for 2 decades that the way you solve manning problems on board ships is you change the required manning. So if your ship was built for 250 sailors, but you can only get 200, we'll change the required manning to 200, and then you're suddenly fully manned. So now the system's not there to help, but it also is going to protect itself, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what systems do. I have to go back and look and see. There's some more press pieces. There were some folks in Tailhook that their names went out in press. They got removed from command. Turns out they weren't anywhere near the incident that happened. But even by then, once they were out, and they were done. So it has happened. But it's 1,500 incidents. I don't know of any that you're reporting did that to. This one's really obvious. To some degree, the manner in which he was removed, the time frame he was removed, and the things that happened to him and continue to happen to him in the time frame past removal is a vindication of everything I wrote. It is, press report, Navy's embarrassed. It was right before graduation. CNO's coming, secretaries coming, CNO's at the end of his tenure. No one's really sure what the president thinks, and they're really concerned about what he might say today or tomorrow, and everyone's 1 tweet away from being fired. But at the same time, CNO had seen that investigation before, could have waited another week, and probably could have not held the receptions at the president's quarters the Tuesday night after the president's removed, and he has to stay upstairs, or so goes the story I was told. It's also kind of a textbook, in my mind, textbook case of how not to remove somebody. But I'm not questioning the authority of the individuals to make their decision. I'm just wondering why it was like the way it was and why it was done that way. So my next thing is a meeting to figure out how the faculty senate's determined. So I will stay here and answer questions until 1800 if you want. It's up to you guys. But if there are no further questions, thank you all for coming.